Bonjour, Kinawaya, Ani, Kwekwe, Betasamosake Indigenous, Gidaga, Bijuni Dodem, Nin Machi, Sagik, Nishnaabeg, Peterborough, Nadonjaba. I'm so very, very happy to be here today and to see all these beautiful women smiling back at me. It's such a very, very kind audience. And I'm so happy to finally be in unceded Algonquin territory to launch this book. It's been a long time coming. I always am very, very honored to be in your territory. I'd like to thank our elder for welcoming us to her territory and for sharing such powerful words with us. I'd like to acknowledge all the elders and all the grandmothers and grandfathers that have been in the audience with us today. It's always terrifying to speak after Lee Miracle. So thank you for that opportunity as well. I'd like to thank really the organizers for this. I know how hard you've worked. You found me staples, you found me water, you directed me to the site, so I really appreciate that. Viola, she brought a little punk to our day. We all need a little punk in our day. Vera, your poems are amazing. Wow, I feel like you connected me to this territory even though I was in a gymnasium, so that's pretty amazing. Well, this book came out a little over a year ago, Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, and it began for me as a journey because there was something missing inside me, and I wanted to learn about Mississauga political traditions. I was starving for those traditions, for those stories, for that political culture, for our governance, and for our way of being. I wanted to find out what my own people's traditions had to say about our survival as a people in our homeland, because in my heart, I knew that the relationship that I have with Canada is not the relationship that my great-great-great-grandmothers intended. And Indigenous people, Indigenous women, because we are the backbone of our nations, have over 400 years of experience with Indigenous resistance. Yet, if you go and do any kind of academic research about that resistance, it's almost difficult to find a mention. We're talking about a little bit in terms of the Indian Act and in terms of identity, and that's very important work. We're talked about in terms of violence, which is also very important work. But I think that we know that our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers did a lot more than that to enable you and me being here today, talking about all of these issues that are so important to our land and to Nishnaabeg. So I wrote this book because I know that my ancestors must have done a number of things to ensure that their children and that their grandchildren and that their great-grandchildren would not just survive, but would flourish as Indigenous people. And I wrote this book because part of living as an Nishnaabeg in 2011, with our lands occupied and with our presence being continually erased, is that it feels like something's always missing. And I wanted to fill that missing up with regeneration, with cultural and artistic renaissance, with a celebration of our diversity, with a political resurgence, with a new emergence. If you ever have been or on a hike or out medicine picking, or if you've gone berry picking with an elder or with a grandmother, and you're in a new spot and you're going down the path, every once in a while, that old one will get you to stop and look behind you. And if you're not getting why you're supposed to look behind you, they'll give you a little prompt. Take a look at that tree. Remember that landmark over there, Leanne? Because when we come home from the berry patch, we're going to be going the opposite way down the trail, and I don't want you to get lost. So if we don't want to get lost, we have to keep looking back. We have to be able to read the landscape. Our ancestors were extraordinarily good at reading the landscape, and I think their teaching is literal. But I also think their teaching is conceptual. Because if I apply it to my life right now, if I stop and I look at, let's say, the landscape, the political landscape in Canada, in terms of Indigenous women, in terms of Indigenous peoples, what is that landscape telling me? I hear a lot of talk about reconciliation, and I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is doing wonderful work, but I'm talking about this broader project of reconciliation that Stephen Harper talks about, this new relationship, this moving forward. Well, when I stand here, when I look back, when I take a vision of the Palladian political landscape, do I see Canada assisting us in regenerating our languages and our political systems and our legal systems? No, I do not. Do I see Canada recognizing our sovereignty as Indigenous nations, as Indigenous women? No. Do I see Canada returning land, respecting our jurisdiction, recognizing our land responsibilities? No. Is Canada helping us in healing our most vulnerable citizens? Is it helping us in regenerating our education system? Is it taking responsible for the damage of colonialism? No. But they are telling us that we're reconciling. And that causes me a lot of worry, because when I read the landscape, I don't see a lot of evidence. Well, that's great, Leanne. Now what? Well, I think the one thing that I can do, and Lee Miracle always reminds me of this, because she always walks into a room whenever she's speaking, and she's grounded, and she's strong, and she takes her place, and she teaches us, by the way that she addresses us, that she's sovereign. She does. She's not looking for anyone to recognize that sovereignty. She's not asking anyone to give her permission to be sovereign. She's just acting sovereign. And so I think the one thing that I can do is I can assert my sovereignty as a Nishnaabeg everywhere I can. My body, my mind, my home, my community. I can connect myself to every piece of my territory, no matter what shape it's in. I can learn as much as I can about my stories, about my songs, about my ceremonies, about my languages. I can work on this flourishment of the Nishnaabeg inside, because I don't need anyone's permission or funding or recognition to do that. I can build my nation from the inside out. That's what those generations of women in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, that's what they were telling us. That's what they were doing. But along with that rebuilding, I think we have to continue to interrogate how colonial society constructs race, gender, and sexuality. We have more than two genders. We don't have that rigid gender binary. And if we don't do that, in our nation building, we risk replicating the heteropatriarchy that has excluded and exiled too many of us. You can clap. Well, my elders have always said that it all begins with the creation stories. And in Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, Edna Manitowabi wrote down her version of one of our creation stories. And it's one of my favorite parts of the book. It's the part of the book I didn't write. But one of the reasons it's my favorite part of the book is because Edna tells the story from the perspective of a grandmother, of a woman, and she tells it to our young women. And so many times, I didn't read it until I was editing the book and I was reading her story over and over and over again, that so many of the written versions of our story are not told by grandmothers to granddaughters. And so that shift became very, very important. We have a lot of different creation stories. I can think of 4 off the top of my head, and they're all important. But the one that I'm going to share with you today, and I'm just going to share a little part of it, it's best if you hear this on the land from an elder in the language. But it's the part that Edna has said that I can share through the book. Our elders say that if you know your creation story, and our stories aren't tricky, our stories they're like little seeds that storytellers plant in us. And over your life, under the right conditions, or sometimes even under the wrong condition, these little seeds plant themselves and they grow and they change. They're not instructions, they're not didactic instructions. Creation stories, our storytelling traditions are a conversation. You have to carry them with you through your life. You have to live them. If you hear them when you're a child, they mean something quite literal. If you hear them when you're an adolescent, you start to get a deeper meaning. When you remember them when you're an adult, it sort of hits you, oh yeah, that's what they were talking about. You get the deeper conceptual meaning. So there's a lot of stuff encoded in our stories. They're brilliant, brilliant pieces of literature. And so the stories that are our origin stories hold so many of those teachings about how to live in the world. Our creation stories tell of that creative process that went into dreaming this universe. Our creation stories are the stories of that dream and all of the artistic and creative energy that went into creating everything we know. The story that I want to talk about is the 7 fires of creation, and I'm just going to sort of skip you through the first 6 fires. So Joué Manado, the great unknown, the one who loves us unconditionally, the creator, has a dream. And she dreams the physical world through the first 6 fires. That first fire created the universe through the union of the first thought, intellectual knowledge, and the first heartbeat, heart knowledge, emotion. So everybody who's a student, that should blow you away, right? Because you just had 20 years of education pounded into your head. But our creation story tells us that you need that union with your heart, with your own truth, in order for that to have meaning. So the first fire is that union of the first thought and the heartbeat. The second fire, Joué Manado creates light in the 4 directions. The third fire, she creates the twinnings, the 4th fire, movement. And by combining that duality or the twinness and movement, Joué Manado encapsulates her thoughts into the seeds. The seeds are the 5th fire, and the Manishiak carries those seeds over the earth. The 6th fire was the creation of the first woman, our mother, the earth. Next, Joué Manado set out to create humans, but it didn't go well. It took a really, really long time. It took a lot of prototypes. It took a lot of banging fists. It was frustrating. She wanted to create the most beautiful beings possible. So she dreamed, and she visioned, and she did ceremonies, and she took time, and she tried things out. And she was careful and persistent. And finally, after a good length of time, Joué Manado gently lowered Nishna, that first being, ever so gently to the earth. And if you read a lot of our creation stories, they talk about original man being lowered to the earth. But that's not what our old ones tell us happened in terms of how we are to interpret that story. It's not just any original man. It's not just any first person. It's you. It's me. Joué Manado was busy creating the most perfect, the most beautiful human being possible, and that human being was you, and you were lowered to this earth. And when Joué Manado saw you, her heart swelled with love, because you were the most beautiful, perfect, lovely being. Our elders teach us to insert ourselves into the story, and when you insert yourself into the story, I'm the perfect being. So what does this tell us? This tells us we were created out of love. I was created out of love. And I feel like, had I known that when I was 5, I might have avoided some of the pitfalls of the punk lifestyle. But this story is powerful because when we tell it, when we retell it, it creates this collective space where for just a few minutes, we're liberated from colonialism. We're liberated from that shame that gets dumped on us as Indigenous women. We're liberated. We feel good, we feel valid, we feel valued, and we are seen. In the next part of that story, Joey Manado has lowered me to the earth, and Joey Manado puts his or her right hand to my forehead, and she transfers all of her thoughts, all of his thoughts, from visioning and creating the entire universe into my head. But there's so many thoughts, there's so much creative energy that it can't just stay in my head, and it spills out of my head through my whole body. Joey Manado's knowledge was so immense that I have to embody it. It takes my whole being to carry it around. So this tells us that in order to access that knowledge from an Anishinaabeg's perspective, we can't just be sitting on our computers typing away, because that only gets this little bit of knowledge that's in our heads. We have to be out. We have to be out doing things. We have to be moving. We have to be expressing our emotions. We have to be engaged in spirituality, because it's embodied. It's in our whole physical beings, our emotional self, our spiritual energy, and our intellect. And our life ways, the way that we are in the world, must reflect those components of our being and the integration of those four components into the whole. It also tells us that there's no limit on Indigenous intellect. I went to school in the 70s, and Indians were stupid in the 70s. And my creation story tells us that in my body, I have all of the creative, artistic energy that went into making the entire universe within myself. So I don't need to look anywhere. I don't need Western theory. I need to look inside myself. I need to know myself. I need to be grounded in who I am and take that beautiful person out in the world as a sovereign being and take my space. So our creation story tells us collectively that we have the intellect and the creative power to regenerate our cultures and our languages and our nations. It's all right here in this room. It also tells me that another world is possible, and that I already have the tools to vision it and bring that into reality. And for me, this was one of the most powerful narratives, I think, that I've carried in my life. This belief, because it's been so eroded through colonialism, and it's such the opposite of what broader society teaches us as Indigenous women about our value. But it tells me that another world is possible, and that I have those tools to make that world come into a reality. And so when I start to look at my own community of Peterborough, I see that a lot of times it's been the artists, it's been those Indigenous artists that have been leading me to that understanding, because as artists, as writers, as poets, we're constantly engaged with the act of making something. And that's aligning ourselves with that creation story. So much in colonial society, we become consumers, where we need supper, we buy it, we need clothes, we buy it, we need to go somewhere, we buy it. But that's really different than how our ancestors lived in the world. That's even really different than how my mom lives in the world. When I was little, she would buy toilet paper and light bulbs, and she made almost everything else. So we once had this society of makers and a society of women makers where we made everything: our homes, our tools, our songs, our dances, our ceremonies, our food, our transportation, everything. And when we had that society of makers, we had a society of presence. Because if you're making something and you're not engaged, you're multitasking, you're texting, the thing that you're making doesn't turn out very well. You can come to my house and see the things that I make. So that society of makers means we have a society of presence, because we're engaged spiritually, emotionally, physically, and mentally. And colonialism has fragmented us. But our artists, I think, more than anyone else, has hung on to that idea of presence, of living in line with those creation stories, and I think that's a very, very powerful way of living. Another one of the stories that I spent a lot of time with in this book is, some people think of it as an origin story or a creation story, and others think of it as a recreation story, and it's where the title of the book comes from, Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. And I know that many of you will know this story of the flood that came and that was cleansing the land and cleansing our earth of some of the negative energy. And there was our elder brother, and the animals were on that log in the vast expanse of water, and everyone was going down to try to get some earth. So that elder brother was going to breathe new life into the world. And so all the different animals try, and finally, Rashkon, muskrat, tries. She goes down and she's gone forever. And she brings that pot full of dirt up. And the turtle volunteers her back. And that dirt is placed on the back. And then collectively, all the clans dance that new world into existence. And the earth expands on the back, and we get Kinamkong, the place of the turtle, we call it. And so, again, Edna Manitowabe, who shared these stories with me, says that we're all that muskrat. Each and every one of us in this room has to dive down and swim right to the bottom and get our little handful of dirt, whatever it is, based on our own talents and our own likes, on our clan, on our name, on who we are, and bring that piece up to the back of the turtle. And when we're all doing that, and we all place that pot full of dirt, then together we can dance and vision that new world in. We can't all be getting the same pot full of dirt. We all have to get our own pot full of dirt. We all have to engage in that individual process of searching out, picking up those pieces that colonialism has smashed, the fabric of our society. We've got to go down and pick up those pieces and put them on that turtle's back so that we can rebuild our world. So what are all these stories telling us about leadership? Because another thing that I was thinking about during this, the writing of this book was leadership, and what does it mean to be a good leader according to Nishnaabeg Re-Creation. Well, I think that story tells us that we all have to be leaders, that it begins with each of us. It begins with individuals taking responsibility to live differently and to do things differently. Leadership begins in our homes. Anishinaabe governance begins in our homes. And that's why residential schools was so damaging to our system of governance, because we were no longer able to learn it in our homes. It begins with our families. It begins with our children and our partners. How we make decisions as individuals and as families. How we treat our children and our partners. How we behave when we're under stress. It begins with how we model that leadership as parents, as aunties and uncles, and grandparents and elders. It begins when our women bring those new members or new citizens through that doorway and into this world, into our families and into our nations. It begins when our mothers bring those new citizens up to the breast and teach them about sharing, about nurturing, and about treaties. It grows when we teach our children our values and our ways of being in our 7 sacred gifts. Because leadership for Nishnaabeg people is not about being the boss. It's not about that authoritarian power. It's not about enforcing your opinions on others or power over. It's about that knowledge that comes from being who you are, from being responsible for the gifts you've been given. And it's about being grounded in a nest of good relationships. It's about being kind and gentle with our first mother, the earth. And it's about diversity, because there are a lot of really, really excellent ways of being a Nishnaabeg. A lot of times we talk about those 7 grandfather teachings, And I became interested in learning how to say that in our language. And so, okay, I'll admit I Googled it. And I got a few ideas, and then I talked to Shirley Williams, and she helped me. And then I went to one of my Mississauga elders, a lot of you will know Doug Williams, and I said, what do you call them in Kirk? Like, what do Mississauga people call those 7 grandfather teachings? And he said, well, you gotta stop saying the 7 grandfather teachings because we call them Kukum de Bajamawan. Grandmother teachings, grandmother stories. That's how we refer to them in this area where we live. And we do that because they were taught to the children from their grandmothers. And the grandmothers used to do this through storytelling. So they would tell a story about someone in the family or in the community who embodied that teaching in a special way. And they would teach the child that by connecting them to that person, connecting them to the example, and acknowledging the leadership that that individual was providing the family. So then he started talking about Akadeowin, which is commonly translated as courage, or the art of being brave. And Doug, his traditional name is Gidigam. He explained to me that this is not courage in the sense of a superhero, but it means to him strong-hearted, not in a physical sense, but in relation to truth. So it might be used to describe the weakest person in a community physically, but it's the kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are, a grounding of self-knowledge, authentic power. So it might describe one that's given strength from family, from stories, from teaching, someone who is given strength because they know the language. And because of that self-knowledge, the one who has Akadewan is without fear or foe of the unknowing. So you're without fear, you're without anxiety, you're without that nagging voice in your head that says you're not good enough. And because he or she is confident about who she is and where she is going, she becomes full of courage. And of course, that confidence is always exercised within that tremendous teaching of humility. In speaking to Debwewin, or the art of truth, or as some elders would say, Odebwewin, the sound of the heart, think about how your life is transformed when you start to listen to the sound of your heart. Think about how the decisions that you make in your life become grounded when you're listening to the sound of your heart. Think about how your life is transformed when you think of courage, not in a superhero kind of way, but as the one that gets their strength from being grounded in self-knowledge. And I think the really beautiful thing about those teachings is that we don't need anybody's funding or recognition or permission to enact them, to live them, to carry them forward, to teach our children them. And so that's just a glimpse of some of the things that I learned when I was engaged in this decade-long process to write Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. I think the actual writing of it probably came really quickly, but I think that I had to live a good decade carrying some of these ideas around before I knew what they meant. After I was speaking with Gidigam Megazé, who I've known for about 15 years, I asked him about words for leadership, because often we hear the word Gima or Ogima for chief. And I was asking him if that's a word that his teachers would have used. And he remembered Eniganzik, which he told me meant the one to go first, the first to face the future, the first to face danger, and also the one that should be acting as a protector. He explained his understanding of this to be the one who leads with reluctance, and it's done out of a sense of responsibility and sacrifice rather than a desire for esteem or accolades. And so it's not that authoritarian style of leadership that's based on unilateral decision-making or coercion or hierarchy. It's that style of leadership based on humility, emergence, collectivity and decision-making, sharing of the work, and inaction. To me, it's leadership based on listening. And so in my own urban community of Peterborough, we have all kinds of examples of this. And I know that you have all kinds of examples of it here. I know there's all kinds of examples of this sitting in this room. But for me, in my community, I think of the woman that started Nishnaabeg and all the ones that continue to work hard to run it. I think of the ones at Odawa Friendship Centre, that one that started the Bamazo in school, the one that runs Odawa Festival every year, the medicine woman that runs our sweats, our fasts, and heals us when we are sick, that auntie that made us all those dictionaries and CDs and books so we wouldn't have any excuses not to learn a Nishnaabeg Moan. Those language teachers, they're the hardest working people in Nishnaabeg country, I'll tell you. She's the one always patiently answering all our Nishnaabeg Moan questions by phone, email, even at the grocery store. That one that dreamt our Nojem theatre into existence, and the one that protects Nojem and keeps us dancing, always dancing. That one that keeps bringing us artists to keep our children's eyes dancing. Those little ones that dance at our powwows with their jingles and fancy shawls. The one that carries the little boy. The one that's the midwife. The one with the court case. The one who knows about the teaching rocks. The one that makes those songs. The one that makes the movies, the actors, the playwrights, the producer, the poet, and the little poet. All those storytellers. The language teacher that walks around the lakes and takes care of Nokomis Dibikizis. The one that lets us build lodges in her backyard. The one that's always clowning around and keeps us laughing. The berry fasters. Those Cree singers and dancers and writers that came to share. Those Haudenosaunee women who are our closest sisters. All the ones that gave birth and care for that next generation. There's so much creative power in my community. We have a community of leaders. And I feel so very lucky to be a part of what's happening there. And really in my community, and I think in this community, if we acknowledge it and if we look for it, we see these women emerging when we need that leadership and then stepping back when the issue goes away. I see them passing on those responsibilities when another comes along. I see a whole lot of ceremony. I see a lot of collective decision-making, inclusion, and supporting each other. I see a beautiful diversity of clans. I see a lot of gentleness. And you know what? I see the embodiment of Kukum de Majamawan, and no one is called chief, and no one is called counselor. Everybody is just really, really, really busy doing. And so I think what these women have taught me is that our leadership is about relationships. At a core, it's about taking care of myself, about being grounded in balance and knowing who I am as a Nishnaabeg Kwe. It's about humility and responsibility. It's about starting with what we have and where we are. But most of all, I think it's about vision. It's about truth-telling and naming. It's about telling our stories and dreaming a different world and then working collectively to bring that different world through that doorway and into our lives. Over the weekend I was in Toronto and I got to see one of the Summer Works plays by Wawate Fokuster, who's from Grassy Narrows, who's a Nishinaabeg playwright. And the play is called Medicine Boy. And at the beginning of the play, an older man comes on stage and he smudges himself at the beginning of the theater. And then he says, "I keep lighting the 7th fire, but it keeps going out. So I light it again." And I took that with me because I feel like whenever I give these talks, and I know in my own self, I have this expectation that I spark that 7th fire up and boom, everything changes. And our spirituality is powerful, but our people are also persistent. And we have to keep lighting that 7th fire. We have to keep lighting it over and over again because it is going to catch. And it is going to be a really, really beautiful, beautiful world. Miigwech.